Okay, so in 7.3, we start talking about something called a complex number. And complex numbers are numbers that are considered imaginary. So this is in 7.3. And we talked about before the fact that if you have the square root of -1, well, you really can't think of two numbers that multiply together that are the same that are going to give you -1. So we actually have a term for that, and that's called an imaginary number. And so I is defined as the square root of -1. If I wanted to square I, so if I wanted to establish what I squared is, then I would do the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which would be -1, because remember that when we are squaring something, multiplying it by itself, we're looking for a group of two because we're looking for the square root, a group of two numbers that we could pull out, and that's going to give us our -1. So throughout this lesson, 7.3, it's going to be important that you remember these two things, okay? It's going to be, and I'll probably write it at the beginning of every page. It's going to be important that you know that the square root of -1 is I, which is an imaginary number. And it's going to be important that you know that I squared is equal to -1. If you know that, these problems are going to be pretty easy for you. So the first and all of these are actually have the same direction. So there's 6 of these that it says express each number in terms of I. Okay, so the first problem is the square root of -7. Well, I know that -7 is prime. I also know that I can't really do anything with this without using I because it's the square root of a negative number. But if I broke it down into saying, well, -7 is really -1 times 7, then I could break it into the square root of -1 times the square root of 7. Well, that goes back to what we were saying before. The square root of -1 is just I. So I could say, well, that's I times the square root of 7. And that would be my final answer because 7 is prime and I can't pull anything else out of that. So what happens if I have the square root of -16? Well, we know that you can't take the square root of a negative number, but we could say that's -1 times 16. Okay, and in this case, we could actually break that 16 down, into 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, right? If we found the factors of 16, did the factor tree, like we did where we have the prime factors of 16, well, we've got 4 2's there. Well, we know that if we break this down, we know that the square root of -1 and then times the square root of 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. Well, this is the square root of -1 is I. That's what we got from the beginning. And we know that we can pull out anything that we have a group of. So I could pull out a 2 for this, and I could pull out a 2 for this. Well, this is what we have all together. So 2 times 2 is 4. And then usually people would stick the I in the back, and that would be the final answer for that. Okay. So let's look at some more of these. Remember that the important things, we know that the square root of -1 is I. We also need to know that I squared is equal to -1. So if I've got negative square root of -13, and my directions are express each number in terms of I, okay. Well, when I break this apart, that would be negative, and then I could do -1 times 13. Well, then I would have negative square root of -1 times the square root of 13. 13 is prime, so I can't really, I mean, if I do that little tree thing, there's not going to be anything I can do because 13 is prime. So we've got negative. This is I. And then this is going to stay the square root of 13 because there's nothing I can pull out of that. So I would have negative I times the square root of 13 is my final answer. Okay. The next one says we've got negative square root of -64. Well, once again, we can break that into negative, and then we can say -1 times 64. But 64 is not prime, so we would have to break that up into our groups or pairs. Most of you probably know that 8 times 8 is 64, but if we wanted to break it on down even further than that, we could find our prime factors of 64 and divide that completely out so that we have, okay, well, this is negative square root of -1 times the 64 part is going to have 6 2's. So our final answer would be negative I, because square root of -1 is I. And then we've got one pair of 2's that we could pull out, another pair, and one last pair. So when you multiply all this together, 2 times 2 times 2 would give you 8. Bring this negative down, and usually the I goes in the back of the term. Okay. Still want to remember that we've got -1, square root of -1 is I, and that I squared is equal to -1. So if I want to do the square root of -48, we're going to have to find the factors. 48 is not prime, so we're going to have to find the factors of 48. 2 will go into 48 24 times. 2 will go into 24 12 times. 2 will go into 12 6 times. 2 will still go into 6 3 times. 3 is prime, so I could be done. So when I break this up, I would have -1 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 3, and I'm getting that from over here. So the square root of -1, I do have a pair of 2's that I could pull out. I have another pair of 2's that I could pull out, but this 3 right here doesn't get pulled out. It's just going to stay square root of 3. We're going to multiply the 2 times 2 together, which is going to not be 2. It's going to be 4, right? And so we're going to have 4. Then most of the time people put the I in the back of the number and then the square root at the end. Okay, we have another one like this, 5 times the square root of -20. Okay, when we do this, there's not anything I can do that 5. I can break up the -20 into -1 times 20. I'm going to have to look at 20. 2 goes into 20 10 times. 2 goes into 10 5 times. Okay, so we've got 5, and we've got the -1 times 2 times 2 times 5. Well, 5 is going to stay out front. We know that the square root of -1 is I. We've got a pair of 2's. We can pull one of those out. And we have this 5 that's left underneath, nothing to go with it underneath the square root. And so when we multiply this stuff together, 5 times 2 is going to give you 10 I square root of 5 when we combine all that stuff together. Right, so the square root of -1 is I squared is -1. That's going to be very important that you remember that. These are complex numbers, and this is what 7.3 is going over. Okay, so I'm going to turn it up just a little bit and use some, so we're going to work 2 problems that are like this. It says, add or subtract and simplify. Okay, so we have two of these that we're going to look at. So we've got parentheses, 8 plus 6i plus 3 plus 2i. And what we know about the plus sign in the middle of the parentheses is that when you distribute a positive to both things, it doesn't change anything. So we could rewrite this without the parentheses. If it's a negative sign here, and we have a whole different story, right? It would make everything be the opposite. But when it's a plus sign, we could just remove the parentheses, combine like terms. So the 8 and the 3 would go together, and that would be 11. If we've got 6 i's and 2 i's, those could go together, and 6i and 2i would be 8i. So pretty easy on that one. I can't put this together because these are 11 and 8i are not like terms, so I would be done with that one. So 4 plus 5i minus 6 minus 3i. And remember, we're not really having to use this a lot here, but I is defined as the square root of negative 1. So I squared is defined as negative 1. Those are the two things that we kind of want to keep in mind while we're working these problems. Okay, this is different because there's a minus here. So that means do the opposite of whatever is behind the parentheses. This parentheses in front of the 4, we don't have anything here. So we could just write 4 plus 5i. There's nothing in front there. But then we want to do the opposite of 6, so negative 6. And the opposite of a negative 3i, which would be a positive 3i. We want to combine like terms. So the 4 and the negative 6 would go together to be negative 2. 5 i's and 3 i's would be positive 8i. Okay, so that's how that's going to work. Okay, now we're going to talk about multiplying them. Again, you want to remember that the square root of negative 1 is defined as I, and that I squared is equal to negative 1. It's going to be important. So if my problem says to multiply the square root of negative 16 times the square root of negative 25, well, we kind of did this before. If we break these down individually, there's a couple of ways we could do this. I know that 4 times 4 is 16. Okay, so we could break that down, but we also know that the square root of, so we could say negative 1 times 16. Well, we know that the square root of negative 1 is I. We know that the square root of 16 is 4. And so together that would give me 4i. Okay, now let's talk about the square root of negative 25. Well, that's negative 1 times the square root of 25. So I could break that into parts, the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Well, the square root of negative 1 is I. The square root of 25 is 5. So I could say, well, this is just 5 times I. Okay. Now, when I put those together, I would do 4 times 5, and then I would do I times I. Well, that's 20. And then I times I would be I squared. Now hold on a minute, because we have this thing up here that says I squared is equal to negative 1. And I have an extra long tail on that. Sorry, it doesn't look like an I anymore. So we've got 20I squared. Well, that was going to be 20. And since I squared is equal to negative 1, the final answer is going to be negative 20. Okay, so what happens if I do the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1? Well, the square root of 25 is easy, right? It's just 5, because 5 times 5 is 25. The square root of negative 1 is I. So when we put those together, we would just get 5i on that one. Okay, not too bad. We're going to continue with these multiplication problems for the rest of this 7.3. got several more examples that we're going to look at. We're still multiplying. We still want to remember that the square root of -1 is equal to I, and that I squared is equal to -1. So if my problem is take the square root of 4 times the square root of -64, I'm going to stop drawing these factor trees every time just because these come out even. So the square root of 4 is just 2, right? I mean, we could break this up just so that we can remember that we've got the square root of a negative, but we know that the square root of -1, now we know that that's I, and we know that the square root of 64 is 8. So 2 times 8 is going to give us 16I. Okay, what happens if they have 6I times 8I? Well, we would want to put together the things that are alike. So we could do 6 times 8, but we're still multiplying everything. So I times I. Well, 6 times 8 is going to give us 48. And then I times I would give us I squared. Right here, you should go, oh, wait a minute, there's an I squared, and I know that I squared is -1. So this really means 48 times -1, which is -48. Okay, what happens if I have -7I times -9I? We're still going to multiply the numbers, -7 times -9, and then we're going to multiply the I times the I. Well, -7 times -9 is 63. And then we have I times I, which is I squared. So we've got 63. Since this is I squared, we know that I squared is -1. So our final answer would be -63 for that one. Okay. 2I times 4 minus 9I. Okay, we want to use the distributive property for this. So we're taking the 2 and multiplying it by both things behind the parentheses. So we've got 2I times 4. Well, 2 times 4 would give me 8I. And then 2 times, this is a -9. Be careful about that. 2 times -9 would give me -18. And then I've got I times I there. So we've got 8I minus 18I squared. I don't know anything about I other than it's the square root of -1, so I want to leave that alone. But I do know that I squared is equal to -1. So this is really -18 times -1. Okay, and so that's going to be 8I. -18 times -1 is going to be positive 18. Okay. So we have about 6 more examples of this. Once again, you want to keep in mind that the square root of -1 is equal to I. Also want to keep in mind that I squared is equal to -1. That's the important facts to kind of remember here. So if we have -3I times 1 plus 9I, you're going to take the -3I and multiply it by 1. You're going to take the -3I and multiply it times 9I. So -3I times 1, well, that's just -3I. -3 times a positive 9, that's going to get you -27. And then I times I would get you I squared. Well, we know something about I squared. We know that I squared is -1. So -3I, -27 times -1 is going to end up being a positive 27. Okay. 2 plus I times 1 plus 4I. So this is the same as any other problem that we would use FOIL on. We would want to take our first, we're doing the first, outer, inner, last. So 2 times 1 is 2. Outer would be, since they're both positive, we would have a plus, and it's 2 times 4i. Inner, which is going to be also positive, I times 1. And then last would be 4i times I. And we're going to see if there's anything we can combine. We've got a 2, and this is going to make an 8i when we put it together. 1i is just, we can go ahead and stick the 1 in front, but you don't have to. 4 times I would be an I squared. Okay, well, this is just a 2 right now. These two can come together and be 9i because they're like terms. 8 i's plus 1 more I would be 9i. And then this, I see an I squared, and I squared is -1. So that's really 4 times -1. So we have 2 plus 9i minus 4. Well, these two can go together. 2 minus 4 is -2 plus 9i. And that's going to be my final answer. It would also be correct if you wrote it backwards. 9i minus 2 mean the same thing. And it's perfectly fine to write them that way. Okay. So we have a few more examples like this. Remember that the square root of -1 is equal to I, and that I squared is equal to -1. Okay, so we've got 1 plus 2i times 1 plus 3i. We're going to do first, which is 1 times 1, outer, and they're both positive, so it would be a plus 1 times 3i, inner, 1 plus 2i, and then our last terms would be, they're both positive, so we'd have 2 times 3 times I times I. This is still 1. This is going to end up just being a 3i. This is going to end up being a 2i. And this is going to end up being 6i squared. Well, we know something about I squared. I squared is -1. So we can start putting these. We got a 2i and a 3i, so those could go together and be 5i. And then this really means 6 times -1, which is -6. So now these can go together. 1 minus 6 is -5 plus 5i. It would also be the same if you said 5i minus 5. These two things mean the same thing. Okay. If I have 3 minus 7i squared, okay, a lot of people are going to try to just say that this 2 goes with both of these things. Remember, that's not true. This is not 9 minus 49i squared, okay? This actually means that you're squaring this, so you're multiplying this by itself. So 3 times 3 is 9. Then we would have, so first outer, then we would have, one of them is positive and one of them is negative, so it's going to be minus 3 times 7i. Inner, again, we're going to have minus 3 times 7i. And then last, they're both negative, so it's going to be plus 7 times 7, I times I. Okay. 9 minus 21i minus 21i plus 49i squared. I see an I squared. We know that I squared is -1. So we can start, these two can go together. -21i minus 21i, that's going to be -42i. And then 49 times -1, because I squared is -1. So 9 minus 42i minus 49 These two can go together. 9 minus 49 is negative 40 minus 42i. Or you could write negative 42i minus 40, and those would be the same answers. Okay, we have two more examples like this, and one of the reasons why I like to work with several examples of these is just because a lot of people haven't seen this whole concept of I before. It's not that it's super difficult, it's just sometimes it's intimidating when you haven't seen it before. So these are the two facts we want to remember. We're going to do 5 plus 7i and 5 minus 7i. So we're going to multiply 5 times 5. First, outer, this is a negative 7, so this is going to be a positive times a negative. So it's going to end up being a minus 5 times 7i plus 5 times 7i. And positive times a negative is going to be minus 7 times 7, I times I. So we've got 25 minus 35i plus 35i minus 49i squared. Well, these are going to go away because they cancel each other out, and we're going to have 25 minus 49. And remember that I squared is negative 1. So 25 minus, negative 49 times negative 1 is going to be a positive 49. Well, we're able to put that together too. So 25 plus 49 ends up being the final answer, which is 74. That's kind of crazy that all of this stuff collapsed out into just 74. The last problem we have on this is 8i times 8i, which is pretty easy. So you're going to do 8 times 8 and I times I. So 64 I squared. Well, we know I squared is negative 1. So 64 times negative 1 is going to be negative 64. Okay. And so that was the end of 7.3. I'm going to go ahead and cover 7.4. 7.4 involves solving quadratic equations. We've talked about this briefly before. Hold on one second. So that was the end of 7.3.